we're developing for next semester. In fact, we're developing text-based adventure games that use GPTs it uses GPTs to run the text-based adventure game and to practice very basic rhetorical skills, right? So it allows students like, hey, instead of just saying like, you know, after learning about, logos, pathos, and ethos, right? These persuasive appeals, instead of just writing, these rote paragraphs in response to prompts that I give every semester. Instead, we're going to have the GPT. We're going to create a script that has the GPT ask the student what adventure they want to take. Do you want to do you want to negotiate for a salary increase? Do you want to ask your romantic partner, or do you want to try to get your romantic partner to go on this trip or something else, right? And then part of this process, part of the game is using different appeals, and built into the chatbot experience or the game is providing critical feedback. Like, so if the experience, or if the student's paragraph or dialogue with the simulated partner or the simulated boss is not convincing according to certain criteria that we lay out within the fine-tuning process, then they don't get what they want, right? But if it is convincing, then they do get a bump and they can actually push the adventure further.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Balázs Kegel, and this is the I Scientist podcast, where we explore artificial intelligence, the body, and the soul. And this time it's my great pleasure to host Joa Glad, who is an assistant professor and chair of the Department of Integrated Studies at the College of Western Idaho. And so you are teaching English literature and writing, and you're very active on using the most modern tools like GPT for both writing and also for teaching writing, and also even for teaching using AI for writing. So we are sort of like Twitter buddies. We we follow each other and pay attention to each other tweets and like them. So that's how we met. And basically the last thing that really triggered me to contact you was that you wrote something about John Vervaake's video essay on AI, which I really like, and I think it should receive more attention. And I love to discuss it with anybody who is interested in that. So, how are you today, Joel?
Thanks, Blash. Great. Yeah. No, I that's doing well, and yeah, thanks for that introduction. And yes, it's been I work quite a bit with these emerging tools that are incorporating LLMs, large language models, and other forms of AI. And so it's been interesting to to kind of see how quickly things have been changing in the past year and a half. And then more recently just was getting into what I think the first time I heard of John Vervaeke was, and I don't know how much we'll talk about him specifically, but the first time I heard of him was, I think, when Tim Ferriss interviewed John Vervaeke. I don't know. Do you know who Tim Ferriss is? Yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, so he interviewed him I don't know how many months ago, a few to several, but I remember listening to that. I think I was working out and listening to that podcast, and I really liked his conceptual approach um, to ethics and thinking about modern life, and kind of dove in when it watched the Meaning Crisis series, most of it, and then just more recently kind of his work on the intersection of cognitive psychology and machine learning and AI. And I've found that kind of, I think, helpful in some ways as a kind of a framework for thinking about the I think the struggles that I see with some of my students as they kind of dip into these tools, and as an educator, when I introduce these tools, they're surprising, like uh, I guess surprisingly, there's concepts from Vervaeke that are kind of helpful for keeping in mind. Just I think I can provide a better experience if I kind of go back to some of these basic things. So yeah.
Amazing, amazing. Yeah, he was a lighthouse for me. So actually, I use him for guide. Like he is a map. Basically, what he gives me is a complex, but it's a map on which I can place a lot of things. So I really like his stuff, including his work on how to align AI, and we'll talk about that later, maybe. I want to cover three topics, and all the three are pretty broad. So let's see how it goes. First of all, so I'm an engineer. I'm an AI researcher. Started in the 90s. My last encounter with formal writing education was in high school. We never learned technical writing. I was in an engineering school, but I write a lot, and I'm very much interested in writing and learning to write better. So that would be the first topic, is like, how did you get to this, uh, both into writing and analysis of text? And then we can go into to how to use AI. What is the interaction between these AI writing tools, writing itself, and writing education? And the third one is we can cover a little bit of what we like about John Vervaeke. So my first question would be: so how did you end up teaching literature and writing? What did attract to you to this profession?
Yeah, so yeah, it's a good question. So let's see. I grew up with just my background, just growing up. My mom was English teacher in high school, and she was kind of big on um just having a foundation in that, I guess, more broadly speaking, kind of the liberal arts tradition, arts and humanities. That yeah, it's just kind of being grounded in that. And so I kind of grew with that as my background. And then I went to university, and it's called Wake Forest University in North Carolina, and ended up first on a pre-med track, but then I kind of, after taking a few courses in literature and philosophy, I kind of pivoted pretty quickly and got more into those areas. So kind of like philosophy and literature have always been coupled for me. Um, but I think I started to notice when I was working on like my honors thesis in undergrad that uh, as I would kind of blend, these conceptual frameworks from philosophy and into how I analyze literature, that it would like my audience would have like it would have like a noticeable impact on my audience. They would see things differently, and I kind of got, it was well received. And so it just kind of seemed something that felt more natural to me to kind of make that blend and think about literature in those ways. And so from there, I just started applying to grad schools. I got my PhD in literary studies from University of Wisconsin at Madison, where I focused on American literature. And my dissertation was about kind of the intersection of like early like proto-demography in the United States. So like, getting general estimates of the population and then mapping those onto these more uh, narrative tropes about what the significance of these population increases, right? And so there's kind of like a theological dimension to these things. And so the dissertation kind of tracked that and kind of made an argument about how to think about these there's like a horizontal dimension and a vertical dimension to these tropes. And then from the early modern period, so like the 16th century, or sorry, the early 17th century up through the mid 19th century, all the way up to Thoreau and James Fenimore Cooper. So yeah, so I've always had this, kind of I think, interest in the combination of literature and philosophical concepts, how they can come together in my writing. And then after defending my dissertation, or while finishing up my dissertation, I kind of just felt exhausted by research writing, and just kind of the state of being a professor in American universities today. I don't know how different it is from tenure positions in Europe, France or Hungary. I want to know, but in the United States, like you have to publish a fair amount of research writing in the degree that I held, and I was just kind of exhausted by that approach. I didn't find it all that, I found it less interesting than just thinking more philosophically about some of these texts. And with my background, the most natural, like, I guess, workplace is to just begin teaching writing courses, right? So it kind of like leveraged my degree to begin teaching writing courses. We call them first year writing in the United States universities. And so I teach these first year writing courses for a while, teach, research writing, just intro to writing. And out of that, just kind of got more into um, rhetorical concepts and how they're important for just a foundation and for advanced writing. And started to, uh, I guess, pick up tools that I could leverage to help students learn how to practice, persuasive appeals and things like this. So it's kind of very basic. Like the kinds of teaching that I started at was very basic, first year writing, and we would work on, just simple rhetorical choices and how you could practice them in essay writing, right? Um, and that gave me an opportunity to figure out how to leverage certain tools, certain, emerging technologies, to benefit my students, many of whom, I mean, this is an open access institution that I work at. And so that means, like, anyone can apply here. You don't need certain marks. If you apply, then you'll basically get accepted. And so a lot of my students are from semi-rural areas. They do not have a lot of privilege. A significant percentage are first year, like they're the first person in their family to get to college. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of the story up until, I would say, the pandemic. 2020
Ah.
was is kind of I think marks a big shift in how writing is taught um in higher ed, because of the shift towards asynchronous formats, online formats, right? There's kind of this big shift, and um and suddenly instructors, faculty at all these institutions needed to be able to, like, recreate their lesson plans and deliver instruction online over Zoom, right? Um, and they had to figure out what kind of tools were like best fit for this new modality. And we had been doing, I mean, online had been like, faculty had been trained in online well before this. Most people in my institution would have certifications and teaching online, things like that. But it kind of 2020 forced us to treat this as our primary modality, right? For at least a little bit, for a few semesters. Um, and you saw like this explosion in ed tech tools, right? And so, and whereas before, I think online at my institution and many others was kind of like not niche, but maybe it was considered as uh, inferior in some ways to in-person education. And to some degree, it still is. It's like, oh, it's not as good if you can't be there in person, take an online course. But I think during 2020, it's like, hey, this is all we have, right? So what technologies do we need to make sure that this works quite well? And so they kind of accelerated things. Um, and certain faculty, including myself, kind of dipped more into certain kinds of teaching and then certain tools that were suitable for this new modality, right? Or at least, like, hey, this is our primary modality. If the majority of our degrees and courses are now fully online, right? How do we adapt to this, and what tools are going to be best for students who require a lot of support? And so for me, what that looked like is, I began getting more into open education resources, open education practices, because so open education, OER, A big part of this is developing textbooks by faculty that are made freely available to students, right? And we can share these, we can remix them, we can distribute them freely, right? And so the benefit of OER is you can get these to students, very quickly, at no cost to them. There are institutional costs, and it requires a lot of labor, but no cost to the student, and it's online. Um, and coupled with this is the ability to share pedagogy, like, hey, this is how I present the material. There's kind of this robust framework that is created around these materials where it becomes, you start to share ideas faster as faculty, right?
What I would be interested in a little bit is why do we write and why do we learn to write, and who are you teaching? So you mentioned a little bit that this is an open college, so you don't need an entrance exam or marks. Uh,
Mhm.
so what are your students going to use writing for? Why are
Yeah.
they signing up for the writing course, and why do we write, in general? What are the different objectives?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, like, and I think that the context of this is the institution that I teach at is important because students, when they come into my classroom, um, they they're just thinking about a job. They're like, hey, I want to get a job, right? And some, like, a certain amount of students do get transfer degrees and they'll transfer on to another institution and get their bachelor's or go on to grad school. But the majority of them are just looking to get into the workplace as fast as possible. And this is very different from the institution that I went to for undergrad and certainly grad school. And so what I thought I wanted out of writing at, when I was in their position is not what they're thinking, right? It's taken me a while to kind of adjust to that, but I think it's really helpful because all my teaching and how we think about, making simple rhetorical choices, for them, it's like, hey, how does this transfer? How does this get me a job? Right. Or like, how's this going to pay off and maybe not the workplace, but when I go home or when I hang out with my friends or something like that. Right. I mean, a lot of these students are working, increasingly so that's the case in education, right? Um, but at the same time, so like it needs to have a high impact very quickly. That needs to be very obvious. And so like, in Vervaeke's language, like it needs to be highly relevant, right? And so how we think about them in writing programs is in terms of context. It needs to be highly contextual, and there needs to be a lot of transfer, right? But at the same time, something that we work on quite a bit is voice. And this is kind of strangely related. This is strangely, I think, sometimes orthogonal to um the like, hey, I just want to get a job. Teach me the basics so I know how to make an impact. Beyond that, this is not terribly important. And so we're kind of like sneaking in some ways, we're kind of sneaking in the emphasis on voice and writing as thinking and writing as expression. And these aren't as immediately appealing, right? They sound more abstract. They sound more I guess fluffier to students. But once you hook them with like, hey, here's the workplace benefits. And once you hook them and you kind of you begin practicing style and voice, I think they start to experience language as as flow in ways that they didn't before. And right. And so it becomes something else. And I think this is true for me certainly, but but I think for a lot of people is that there are multiple dimensions to writing. And um i- if writing is become someone's profession, or let's say someone is writing just for like personal reasons, like, hey, I just want to write because I want to think through thoughts, et cetera. There comes a point where it crosses over into writing for someone else, writing for the workplace, like there's a utility to it, and they have to learn that dimension as well. And then conversely, like someone who is writing, just they view it as like, this is just purely technical, it's just for my job. But then it crosses over at certain points into like, oh, hey, this is actually enjoyable. Like I feel like I'm in this email that I'm crafting, I'm kind of expressing myself in some ways. And I see how like, just kind of turn that over to a chatbot, maybe sometimes it's gonna be helpful, but other times like, no, actually I want to take control and kind of enter the zone of writing, right? Um, yeah, so it's hard to, I think, um, it, it's hard to sell writing in for my students as either like, hey, this is all going to be about self-expression and voice, like that's not enough, but also it's kind of stultifying or deadening to say like, hey, this is just going to get you a job, right? Because it's always going to be more than that, right?
Yes, yes, and I guess voice is what will make the difference in this world where we have GPT. Like my partner was saying, she has to write sort of like marketing mails, but for her own course on the internet. And she's tried GPT, but it's not my words, you know. And I have the same feeling sometimes when I use
Mm.
GPT to edit my stuff, because I'm not English is not my first language, so often I just use it for grammatical things and style. And what comes out, it's like I almost like feel it's a GPT starts to have its own voice in a certain
Yeah.
sense, like you can recognize it. And I even got caught. I was not pretending not using GPT, but I have two blogs. One is on Medium where I write more technical stuff, and Medium you can send your blog to sort of editing
Mm.
thing. I don't know if can call it journal, but it's like grouping blogs together, and it goes under their label. And they rejected it because I don't know which tool said that I was using GPT too much. Funny
Really?
thing, I was
That's
writing
fascinating.
about GPT hallucinations.
That's fascinating.
Yes, it is.
So, well, I mean, so we notice, I mean, there's a lot in there that I can respond to, but we do notice that we call them ESL students, English, as a second English as a second language. We notice that ESL students get flagged more by these AI detectors than native English speaking students.
When they
And so
write
there's
their own stuff, or
because they're
because they
using
use it
tools.
more. Ah,
Well, because in some cases they're using tools like Quillbot or Grammarly to help clean up their syntax and just kind of like do, spell check, but also clean it. Like Quillbot uses at least it was around like 2018, I think is when it was started, but it was based just on machine learning, but not LLMs, right? And so it wasn't rewriting like ChatGPT would, right? And so it's partly that, but it's also partly how ESL students write. That it gets flagged more as like, oh, this is machine, not human, right? So there is some kind of inequity there, inequity in how ESL students get flagged versus native English speaking students, right? But yeah, so like it's fascinating to think about like what kind of does ChatGPT or do GPTs have a voice, right? Again, that's that's a kind of like a figure of speech is how we're kind of throwing that around, right? It's like,
I would say
um,
yes, yes, but if you can recognize it, it means that there is an attribute which is shared between two texts of coming out of GPT, and it's somehow like probably like
mhm.
if you want the ontology of it, it's probably a like everybody's voice together that's
Yeah.
being on the internet or something like that. I don't know.
Well, and so this it's a part of how I've been trying to like think about this like more I think at a higher level, but also so like I can think of this as a higher level, and so someone like John Vervaeke can help with that, I think, and thinking about the importance again of relevance and relevance realization as a way that we approach language, right? In the absence of that, maybe that's what we mean by sounding more machinic. It's like, oh, this is just there's not this is not twisted in a way that we would expect a human to twist things. right? And I'm speaking kind of metaphorically here, but I think that's it, right? There's some kind of like twisting manipulation that goes on. We call that style. Um, and we can like we can use like GPT-0 and zero GPT and Turnitin. They try to come up with these AI detectors that will try to quantify like, oh, this is human versus AI, right? But it's very hard. I think it's not enough to quantify it. You also have to have a philosophical grasp of what's going on, right? But the markers they use are things like lexical complexity, right? So, and I've had students, I've used this one marker, lexical complexity, as a way for students to think about like, hey, how do we make your voice more robust, right? And so I'm like, hey, okay, these AI detectors, since they use lexical complexity as one of the things they're looking for, one of the primary things they're looking for, um, we develop lesson plans where it's like, hey, let's work on this. Let's use this as an opportunity to um, write more interesting ways and figure out what it would look like for us to to increase our lexical complexity, right? So things like um, creating similes and writing, using figures of speech in a paragraph or in a sentence. When we do this, when we use a simile um, to to illustrate a more abstract idea, right?
What is a simile?
A simile, so using like or as, so saying like the like her eyes were as blue as the sky, right? That's a kind of a lame
Okay,
simile,
sorry. Yeah, yeah. Okay, got it.
right? So this would be using similes. The more we sprinkle our language with things like similes and more figurative language, not only does it create more interesting writing, but I think something more psychological something more fundamental is going on. The similes we tend to draw on, like, yeah, this is when I say like her eyes are as blue as the sky, that's kind of cheesy, it's very lame. Why? Because it's something that like anyone would say, but normally when we use metaphors and similes in our language, we actually are drawing on these unconscious reservoirs of tropes and images and things that are based on our experience and things that are based on our worldviews and our belief systems, right? Like this all of this bubbles up as our lexical complexity, right? That's, I mean, it kind of is. So I think like this is for me, the Vervaekean concept here would be embeddedness and like the what's the so you have the four E's of cog-sci. This would be this would be embeddedness, right? It's like the extent to which humans are embedded. They have experiences. Those experiences often, just memories. There's these core memories that are attached to this, and these bubble up in our when we're writing, and they bubble up in how complex our language is, right? And so it's really, in the classroom, and then as you all know, right, when you're writing, and I think I was reading through your Substack articles, and I noticed how you're kind of drawing. Yeah, you're kind of like, writing as expression. You're kind of interweaving these more general philosophical concepts with, you know, this what happened in 2020 or 2021 and your relationship to, or how you picked up jujitsu, right? And just kind of becomes interwoven with our language, with the words we use, right? Does that
Yes,
make
yes.
sense?
So yeah,
Just
yeah, no,
yeah,
absolutely, yes. So it's not just a set of propositions. Some say even that language itself was born through metaphoric thinking. Every word is a metaphor in a certain sense that was used to mean something literal a long time ago,
yeah.
like understand, standing under. Why does it mean that we understand? It's like you can go and I think it was Owen Barfield who had even books on this, like how you can use
Hmm.
language for an archaeology of thoughts of humanity. I think his famous example is pneuma in Greek, which means wind and soul
Hmm.
at the same time. And probably at a certain point in history, those two things really meant the same thing. For us, it's metaphoric now.
So
But
I know
at that
that
time, it was the same. So this is how metaphors created language.
and I know that Vervaeke mentions Barfield, I believe, in the Meaning Crisis, one of the episodes. I'm not familiar with Barfield's work. So is he going back to like ancient Greek thought and saying like, hey, this is how they thought of language as being birthed in metaphor, or is he just developing this based on his
I
own
didn't read
system?
him directly, but I talked to Mark Vernon, who has a monography on him, The Secret History of Christianity. And he develops this idea there that the way that the sort of like the collective soul grew up historically, you can catch those points in language if you analyze the words. And that the interesting thing for me in this, and with respect to what you were saying, is that we are constantly creating those things even when we don't think about it. So there are metaphors, and maybe this is where, you know, English as a second language kicks in, because I saw it so many times that I literally translate something from Hungarian to English, and it sounds poetic, because
Yeah,
in
I can see
Hungarian,
that.
that's like a common metaphor we use for something, or a way we express something used to be a metaphor, like understand. If I say understand in Hungarian literally, it sounds funny and makes you think at the same time. And if I tell that it means understand, which in Hungarian we have a verb which I don't really have a etymology of it, then it really creates sort of like a thought. Okay, that means you are really supporting it, the thought. That's what it means, understanding. And it's actually a very interesting example, exactly understanding, because there's a lot of debate on AI, whether they understand or not, and what does it mean to understand. It's one of those examples where AI becomes a mirror, in the sense that you wouldn't ask this question unless we had GPT, unless we had this some
Yeah.
other tool where it's like sort of like pantomime understanding, and that tool creates the question, what does it really mean understanding? So you can get into philosophy because of this. I
Mhm.
love this. And so we can actually go into the AI thing, because I really love the fact that, you know, your spirit, that you, instead of like, you know, pushing it back, you are taking it on and trying to work with it and teach it. So it's beautiful. Now I was so making a lot of circles, so as I let you, if you had any thoughts on this, I let you speak.
Well, so we can, I guess I can pick up where with the same conversation, like you, so one of the questions so I guess I'll think very specifically about like how I'm using this tool, and then we can kind of expand from there. But like, so you're talking about um how using language, there's always this metaphorical component, and it's really fascinating to see how someone for whom English is not their primary language, and when they're kind of like, you know, transliterating their primary language into English, then the metaphors kind of come to the surface. It's like, oh, hey, I never realized that was a figure of speech, or that was, you know, that was behind that is something else, and it just over time became this more abstract idea, right? And that's the phrase that I'm actually using, right? Like to think, to understand, you know, even these most abstract concepts, you know, are highly concrete at their core in some ways, but they've just been kind of like, you know, they've been transformed. Um, but so it's interesting how those come to the surface, but also like in the classroom, if we're trying to make these, if we're trying to develop lesson plans, then what we're starting to do is create, you know, habits, and habits, you know, teaching habits is all about routine, and it's about repetition, and this is where machines actually do play a role. Right. And so this is how, you know, this is why it's not a matter of always pushing things away, or risk mitigation. It's not always about risk mitigation. Sometimes it's about, okay, these new tools, the ability to enter a script, That's how I kind of use some forms of prompt engineering. They're almost like scripts, like a movie script or like a script within a play. You know, you're kind of like saying like, hey, this is how we're gonna play things out, right? But creating a plan where like I plug a script into ChatGPT and I'll say something like, hey, you're a professor of first year writing, you're an expert in teaching um you know writing style. In this lesson plan, you're going to define lexical complexity, and then you're going to explain how similes play a role in that. And then you're going to prompt the student um, to create their own simile, and then you're going to provide feedback in this manner. So you can create a script around this to try to um, try to help the student practice something that can help them write in a more human manner, right? So it kind of seems paradoxical, but it's not really a paradox. It's just like anything that's routine, anything that's very basic, like a very basic skill like this. That's just a matter of like, hey, you just gotta do it again and again and again. ChatGPT and other GPT platforms can do this pretty well, right? So it's just figuring out like at what point can we leverage these tools within the learning process in ways that do not inhibit active learning, right? So that's one way that I've been kind of thinking through bringing these into the classroom. Um, yeah, so that's not like thinking more generally about AI, but I think that kind of illustrates how these tools aren't always substitutes for being human or writing in more human ways. In some ways, we can kind of use these to do the opposite, right? It's kind of, it can be dialectical or probably is dialectical to some extent.
Hmm. But yeah, I was bringing this up in this way, complementing on your spirit, because from a lot of people in education, the first reaction was panic, and that's probably related to the mechanization of education in a certain sense, that the way we teach students in a certain style allows them to replace their whatever tests they are given to using GPT. So that's again sort of like a mirror, in the sense that this tells you that the way you teach the student is probably for another age, where it had to be, the student had to become a clog in society. So this is why I was saying, like, maybe a question there would be, when you teach students to write, how do you examine them? What are the ways to see that they learned to write, and they learn to write in a way that will be useful for them?
Yeah, so no, you're right. There is a fair amount of anxiety around these tools and how they're kind of reshaping education, or questions like, are they reshaping education? And then if we bring them into the classroom, if we bring them into our lesson plans, if we say like, hey students, it's okay to use this to like write an essay, right? um, then what happens to all of the teaching methods that we've developed in the process? Like where do those go? Because you can't, and the heart of the question is what you just asked, is how do you assess learning, right? And so that's kind of a question that's asked again and again, and you'll see this on X, formerly known as Twitter, um, that this is what a lot of us are trying to figure it out, is like post, ChatGPT, November, 2022, how do you assess learning? And so like I think why tools like ChatGPT became such a threat, and you already mentioned this, is because a lot of education is very mechanized already. And so this just kind of like fills in the gap. It's like, oh, hey, here's a rote prompt that we give every semester, right? It's prescriptive, right? We know exactly what we want from the student, or pretty close to what it should look like. I mean, that's how assessment normally works, or has traditionally worked. Um, And that's exactly what LLMs are really, really good at. It's like they've been trained on this stuff, right? You give them, they've been trained on all these exams, and so they know how to autocomplete in a way. But also, it's even more of a threat because when they autocomplete, it's not consistent. It's always different, and so you can't say like, oh yeah, of course you got it from this place. It's not plagiarism, right? And so it is a threat in that sense. And so like how do you assess? I mean, this is kind of a big problem right now, is how do you assess if you assume that students are using these tools when they're not in the classroom? And increasingly, this is kind of the post-COVID, um, I guess we would say the post-COVID factor or exigency. Um, the background's like, hey, this is not going to go away. Uh, the other big factor is that increasingly a lot of education is online, which makes this even easier, right? Students
Real
are not in the
time, yeah.
classroom, so you can't police them, right? So like there's going to be there's this looming gulf between educational experiences that are in person, that can be controlled, where students can be monitored, and they have to do things like on command. They have to show, like they have to tie their writing to their person, you know. There's a gulf between that and then where much of higher ed is going. Like I'm just gonna get a certification in this area and then go on to do something. But a lot of these problems can be GPT, chat GPT, right? So how do you assess learning when that happens? So formally, before, pre-LLMs, uh, we would assess, in a writing course, we would assess through like a research essay, like, hey, write, you know, 750 to 1,000 words, right? 6 to 8 pages, about an argument about this topic or a topic if you're choosing. You need to have X amount of sources, um, you know, and most of those need to be scholarly, et cetera, right? And so students need to learn how to write introductions, how to support arguments with evidence and reasoning. They need to know how to like identify what a good source is, what a credible source is, right? These are important skills, and they're lifelong skills, right? Um, but you can simulate all of that now with a chatbot, right? So how do you assess whether or not the student actually learned something versus simulated? That's the problem.
Exactly. So how do you do that?
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good question. There's a big split over how to. Right now, it seems like there are a lot of different paths being explored. Some faculty will ban the tool, and they'll write into their syllabus a course policy that says, for any assignment in this course, you cannot use LLM such as ChatGPT. You cannot use AI. And in many institutions now, you'll find in the academic integrity policy that a student cannot submit work as their own if it's been assisted by AI, right? That's actually, yeah. So you'll see that in an academic integrity policies. So this is kind of a big deal. But the key language is here is, what does it mean to be assisted by AI, right?
Exactly.
When you submit something. So I mean, that's a big question. And so at the course level, faculty have to decide for themselves what that means. And so they write these policies into the syllabus, and some are banning. Others are saying like, okay, you can use it up to a certain extent, or you can use it for certain assignments, but not for others, or you can use it, but you must acknowledge it. Um, and if the problem that you run into is that if you want to ban it, then you'll probably need to use tools. We call it one major tool in the United States that colleges use is called Honor Lock. And so this is for online courses. And so whenever you complete an assessment through Honor Lock, it'll record your screen. It'll record the student. They have to like show their phone. They have to show them walking away from the computer with their phone, right? So they are restricted to one tab, and the camera can see everything, and as well as what's on the screen. And so if you use that, there might be ways to game this. Some students try, but like it does kind of lock things down. You could use that in theory for every single assignment, in theory, right? So you could go that route. Like, okay, we're gonna have regular exams throughout the course. We're always gonna monitor what's going on to make sure that the student is actively learning. That is a solution, but it raises Um, it raises a few ethical concerns, especially around surveillance, right? Um, and trust, right? Like there's trust issues with that, but it can be effective. I mean, that's, I wouldn't completely dismiss it. If the primary ethical concern is, are my students learning? That might be, one solution a faculty member could take, right? Um, the other paths I've seen is that, and this is messier, but I've seen this done successfully, is that some faculty, including myself, are allowing for a hybrid approach, but the students need to show their work, show your labor. And so what does that mean? That means they need to show so there's some, like, browser extensions. I think Anna Mills on uh, on X. It feels strange saying X, but on
Twitter,
X,
yeah.
we'll kind of use certain Chrome extensions to
We
see,
are old,
tell
so we will
students
test. We will say Twitter.
yeah, okay, we'll say Twitter. She'll say, like, hey, you need, as part of this course, you need to install this browser extension, and I need to see the history of your document, right? And so part of this browser extension will show if you're copying and pasting from another source, and so kind of be clear, like, hey, we're not gonna, you can use LLMs, but you need to be clear on where you're using that as part of your writing process. And the majority of the labor needs to be yours, yours. And the proxy for this, what's measuring labor is the amount of time that is recorded in the history of the document. So it's kind of an interesting proxy. It's an interesting way to like try to quantify labor. Um, there's certainly ways around it, but that's another solution. For me, something I've noticed is that when students are trained, like so I developed using OER resources, which I've mentioned, when I developed um, a
So
training
can you say
module,
what OER is? Because I
open education resources.
okay, so it's a set
Yeah.
of tools that you're participating in developing, right?
So OER is like, there's this big movement in higher ed to develop OER textbooks, for example, that are free to distribute, to reuse, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like, it's content that I've gotten partially from other faculty, but also content I've created for myself. Like formerly, I would just create a textbook. I would work with the publisher to get that to the students. And then I'll get a kickback every time, a student buys my book, right? So, but now the push with OER is like, no, hey, it's the best interest in, it's in the interest of our students learning to get them resources at low or no cost, and for other faculty to be able to build on our efforts. So this is kind of part of this is like the open
Open
ethos, kind
source,
of like
yeah,
Wikipedia.
nice.
Yeah, it's like Wikipedia, right?
Yeah.
And so I've developed, along with another faculty member at my institution, I've developed training modules around LLMs, and especially as they intersect with writing at the college level, so students understand how they work, their limitations, their benefits, how to acknowledge them, how to cite them. So we have this training that we embed in within the course, and then we have open conversations around, what they want to get out of the course, what they feel like they need to learn. And then we go through, like, some ways that this can become part of their workflow, without inhibiting their learning. And then this is how,
Exactly.
and then building in expectations, like, hey, we want to see that you've contributed X amount of labor to the final project or to the major projects. And we're finding that students are not trying to cheat the system if they feel like they're learning something that's going to pay off in the workplace, and they're also learning, like, they want to feel good about themselves becoming better writers. They care about
Absolutely.
that.
No, I loved
Yeah.
it. It's Lisa Long, right? Your colleague. You
Yes.
mentioned. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Liza
watched
Long.
your
Yeah.
video and I almost want to take that course because I do AI research, but this is very different to develop these things and use them. And so people who try to ban it in the classroom basically creating the gap between education and workplace, right? And this has been sort of like the tradition, at least where I am coming from. Like 90% of what we learned at school was about something that you never use later, and you could perhaps make a case that we were learning to learn and stuff like this, but I don't think those things were the best suited for that purpose either. And so I don't know, for the industrial society, we developed the sort of educational system where we put everybody in the same box and try to, you know, make them good workers in the factory, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow this, at least in Hungary, where I came from, like, you know, my high school was in the 80s, so that time it was really sort of like building almost robots. And then we got into information society, and of course it was completely useless. Now, of course, no, I became researcher, so I was on the top echelon of the students, and so we did pick up the skills to learn lifelong. And in any case, that was my sort of like my prior predisposition. But that gap between school and life sort
Mm-hmm.
of, I just got bigger and bigger. Like my son, for example, he's really smart. He dropped out of school and during COVID because he hated it, and he went on his own path. And there's nothing really developed for him other than everything on internet, which he's picking up, you know, history from YouTube and philosophy from YouTube, but it's not a formal tool. And so I really
Mm-hmm.
love what you're doing. You try to like channel into your education all the latest things that are coming out of tech, because I think that's the way to go, not only for students, but even for me. I'm 50 and I would really love to take your course how to use GPT, because I'm just finding out by myself, you know. So so yeah, I mean, I'd like to congratulate you on it, and I'm really interested in, you know, what is your experience with it? Like, what are the actual ways that you use GPT in writing, and what are the tools to teach those uses, which is not the same thing, right? So
So the yeah the, no so the lesson the OER that we developed, the open education resource that we developed, does try to begin to introduce readers to, like, hey, this is how you can think about, you know, what role it might play in your writing. Um, but I think you've interviewed a writer on your podcast, right? Yeah, and I think I caught parts of the conversation where, you know, something they mentioned, and I have seen this, is that working with some of these tools can actually create more labor for
yes,
the
that's
writer,
my
but
experience
leads,
too. It slows me down. Yeah.
yeah, but it leads to different results, right? So it's definitely in flux. This is something that a lot of educators are experiencing with how to use these tools. And I've seen, like, you know, a huge variety of things. The most common use, and I think this is kind of a natural fit for educators, because of how assessment works, in a first year writing course. But the most common use, I think, early on, and it still is, you know, highly common, is to use these tools to generate feedback. And then students will kind of use this feedback to they'll have to evaluate the feedback, and that'll be part of the peer review process, right? So before, it would be like, okay, it's just a student who doesn't have a lot of experience with sophisticated writing, or doesn't have a lot of experience with leaving sophisticated feedback. Now they get the assistance of AI, and they need to evaluate that generated feedback, and then pass that along um, to the student who wrote the essay, right? And studies, and there's early research that shows that actually AI assisted feedback is superior to non-assisted feedback, right? So there do seem to be results there. Um, and so that could be part of the workflow. It's
So
like
what was the
you've done
control, the non-assisted feedback?
so the study was, and I can send this to you afterwards, but this is recently published. The study showed that, like, there's they the control group, um they were looking for whether or not students were uh how they went from AI assisted feedback to no assistance at all, or to partial assistance. And then I
Uh,
think there's a like a third there's like a third
I see.
group.
So there is like a scale of assistance. Okay.
Yeah,
But
and
it
so
was
what they
like
showed,
versus human
yeah.
assistance or versus no assistance?
No assistance. So what
Assistance.
so
Mm.
the study looked at like, okay, after receiving and I think the control group just received no assistance, right? And so you get like, overall quality feedback, groups that had AI generated feedback first, and then they would be able to say like, oh, this is good feedback. I'm going to pass this along to the writer who wrote the essay, or no, I'm going to make some modifications to this before sending it along, right? That would be how it would work. And those, that was seen as superior work. The feedbacks, it was rated highly by the writers who wrote their essays. They really appreciate that feedback. But then later in the semester, when students who formerly received AI assistance, when they received none at all, like no assistance at all, they actually perform worse than they otherwise would have, suggesting that they got used to the AI assistants, and they were no longer able to perform. They perform actually below the threshold they would have otherwise, without
It's
any assistance to begin
like
with.
atrophy. Like they.
Yeah, atrophy, or they just never they weren't compelled to make certain choices that would have
Mm,
eventually led to certain habits, certain feedback habits. And so like this is kind of an interesting dilemma, is like, what choices do students need to learn? What choices do students need to make during a given assessment in order to um, uh, build in the certain kinds of learning that are important for their future success? I think that's really what's at stake. Like as an educator, what choices am I forcing them to make, with or without AI assistance, right? And so to me, this is really the heart of the issue. Is in the as these technologies roll out, I have young kids myself, right? I have toddlers. I assume, but I shouldn't. And this might be dialectical. There might be kind of a pushback against this, and there's like a huge lockdown, and in lower schools, so there's zero AI. I doubt that, but hey, it could happen. But as these tools kind of permeate the educational experience, and let's say think about writing classrooms, they permeate what writing means. I think this can go two ways. Either we want to make the choices similar or very analogous to how they are currently, right? So like, every student needs to learn how to practice syntax meaning like the order of words in a sentence and order of phrases. um they need, they need to learn how to make these specific choices around syntax. Or in maybe 5-10 years down the road, we're going to say, what, we think the choices are actually going to be more sophisticated than that. They're going to be at a higher level, and maybe we can take these former concerns around syntax. We can kind of take this for granted because we're just working at a higher level at this point, right? And I don't know. To me, that's hard to envision, without kind of seeing where things go. But it might be that just the choices that college
yeah,
students
I
make in
mean,
the future
this is
are just
really hard.
bigger,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's reminds me. I mean, even like driving with an automatic or driving with a stick. Do you drive with a stick? You learn it when you can buy an automatic shift car, or do we teach people to read maps when you have Google Map? But what if your phone is dead? Like, so
I know
these are
that's a
these are
great
tough
that's a great
tough
analogy.
choice. Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
an interesting
exactly.
analogy because it's do you are your driving skills less because you no longer drive a stick, or you no longer drive manually, right? Because you know less about, like, you're becoming less um
Hmm,
embedded within the rhythms of the car when
exactly.
you no longer use a manual, right?
Yeah, that's why I like the stick.
Yeah, so like but it's become a matter of preference versus the default. The default now is not to have a stick.
Yeah, in US.
Right. So will learning in the future be like, okay, hey, you can you can practice these certain basics, but the default is actually going to be to not have to deal with those specifics anymore, right?
Yes,
But I think the problem is going to be in the lower schools, really, where there are certain foundations that are critical for basic thinking and higher level thinking, um, and these personalized chatbot experiences are going to have to. There's going to have to be huge guardrails that make sure students are building those foundations, and I think we just don't know what those are right now.
exactly.
It's you know.
Yeah, like it's almost like the questions like what does make us human? What is this? What is that we have to learn even when we are in like the cyber world where we're almost one with the machine?
Yeah. Yeah. But
And
it
that's
certainly
yeah.
will be more dialogical. This is kind of a
Oh,
Vervaekean idea, right? I would imagine in some ways you might be able to build into, so like, are you familiar with Conmigo?
no.
Have you heard of that? So Conmigo is developed in collaboration with OpenAI. But it's through Khan Academy. They worked on this chatbot experiences specifically to be rolled out within lower schools, elementary schools, that kind of stuff to help students with math, right? So, and many schools are developing these kind of chatbot experiences. Um, and so part of the fine tuning they had to do, and they're still trying to figure out, is making sure that they don't help the students too much, right? Um, And so
Amazing.
how can you, I mean, the dilemma is how do you make sure that the experience is personalized? This, theoretically is supposed to be the huge payoff of more sophisticated AI, is that we can have personalized education, which has been the gold standard for a long time. Um, because if you can have high quality personalized education, it's going to be better than what students currently have. For
Yes.
most, not we're not talking about Rousseau's tutors, right? We're talking about like what the average American student gets is currently worse than what the gold standard of personalized learning would look like, right?
Yes, yes, yes. And there are so many tools
Yeah.
like that were developed for games that put the player in a flow where he or she can improve the most in a setup where we can be in a learning state constantly, not getting out of it because we are in flow. But how to tune that? It's I mean it's amazing domain. So if we are optimistic, this will probably go into the direction, but it still doesn't answer to what are the basic skills we have to learn even when we have access to GPT.
Yeah, no, I think it's because I don't think we can know that the answer to that in advance.
Yeah.
It's almost like something that we just have
Yeah.
to figure out. Like there's, like in retrospect, like, oh, that we went too far there, or students are not prepared to do X. But what they need to be prepared for, what problems they need to solve is always kind of a shifting thing, right? I mean, that's part of civilization, I guess. But so the example you said about um what happens in games, like you enter a flow state. So we are something that I am working on with the CTL, Center for Teaching and Learning at my own institution, as we're developing for next semester. In fact, we're developing text-based adventure games that use GPTs it uses GPTs to run the text-based adventure game and to practice very basic rhetorical skills, right? So it allows students like, hey, instead of just saying like, you know, after learning about, logos, pathos, and ethos, right? These persuasive appeals, instead of just writing, these rote paragraphs in response to prompts that I give every semester. Instead, we're going to have the GPT. We're going to create a script that has the GPT um, ask the student what adventure they want to take. Do you want to like, do you want to negotiate for a salary increase? Do you want to ask your romantic partner, or do you want to try to get your romantic partner to go on this trip or something else, right? And then part of this process, part of the game is using different appeals. And built into the chatbot experience or the game is providing critical feedback. Like, so if the experience or if the student's paragraph or dialogue with the simulated partner or the simulated boss is not convincing according to certain criteria that we lay out within the fine-tuning process, um, then they don't get what they want, right? But if it is convincing, then they do get a bump and they can actually push the adventure further, right?
It's so interesting. And I see both the dangers and the opportunities there, because somebody can take Chris Voss's negotiation book, which is gives you a lot of recipes what to do, and turn somebody into a sociopathic negotiator who will achieve everything they want. But at the same time, with almost the same tools, actually, Chris Voss's book is very interesting because it teaches empathy. Basically, you have to empathize with the person you're negotiating with to be able to achieve your goals. And I see it on my son, he had a sort of like Aspergerish setup. So he but very smart. So he cognitively needed to learn the tools, but also empathizing with others. What's going on behind the scenes, and he did it, and it made him a better person. So it's not only that he can negotiate with people, but these negotiations are such that both of the people in the conversation leave the conversation happy. That's
Yeah.
the most paradoxical idea for me in this. And so I could imagine these tools to go into that direction where even like relationship conversational techniques, which, for example, I don't know if you know Harville and Helen Hendricks. They have this famous book from the 80s about couple therapy and tools for couples, how to converse. They have very strict algorithms how to diffuse patterns and arguments in a very algorithmic way, and those could be completely taught to a GPT, and one
Yeah.
GPT could be there just to teach you this kind of conversation, and the world could be so much a better place if we could do this, right?
And I think the key here, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think because any of these things, like you mentioned algorithms, like a lot of these do revolve around, I mean, a lot of books do this. It's identifying principles and algorithms that can be used part of a custom GPT fine-tuning process, right? It's like, hey, this is, or you can use RAG, right? Or retrieval, what is it? Retrieval augmented generation. Am I
Yes,
using that?
yes.
Is that right?
Yeah,
So you
yeah,
can
yeah.
use RAG to kind of like ground the GPT, at least for that particular like scenario, to ground it with so it's aligned with certain things, so it doesn't go off and default to its pre-training data, right? And I think that's
Mhm.
part of like where we're at, um, at least my institution and others that are rolling out, these customized chatbot experiences. I think like so Ethan Mollick is he at Wharton, I think is really, he does just incredible work around this area. But they have a number of customized, like they leverage OpenAI's APIs, but then they use other APIs to help with more customized experiences. And I think part of the benefit here is that you have more control over the alignment, right? It's like, oh, this is specifically like, here's the alignment that we want. And maybe we don't want to rely entirely on OpenAI's API to do this. We need more control here, right? Um, yeah, but I think and I think Vervaeke is big on this as well, is like part of this process, what's being called into question is the alignment with truth. I think like this is becoming really integral to how institutions are responding to this new technology. It's like it's raising concerns about our alignment to the truth more than it ever has before, or at least,
Exactly.
recently, so like how do we make sure that students, um uh how do we make sure how we deliver these tools in the classroom do not make students care less about the truth, and
Mm.
and versus just truthiness, right? And part of that is going to be in the pedagogy, training students and how they work, but part of it is going to be in the more technical back end, like how do we fine tune and align these tools, so they're not just defaulting to what they've been pre-trained on and just spitting out, they're dreaming, right? This is kind of like the hallucination problem. They're just dreaming, right? So how do we
Yes.
correct for that? Yeah.
Yes, so that yeah, we can slowly move into to John Vervaeke stuff because it's very very relevant, right?
Yeah.
So he talks about alignment in that video essay, and it's I call it a third way because it's neither utopistic nor dystopistic about AI. And one of the main point he makes is that forecasting, predicting what's going to happen, it's really really hard, especially hard predict through what he calls threshold points where there is a fork. We can make decisions there and the world goes this way if we make this decision, and that way if we make that decision. And so it's foolish to predict through that threshold points without actually making a statement of what we want to do there. And so at the end of the video essay, he arrives to a set of threshold points where we will have to make decisions about what to do. And one of them is, for example, embodiment. His main point is that, as you said, right now, ChatGPT doesn't care about the truth. It's not that it's lying, because for lying, you have to know the truth and you have to want to deceive me on purpose. Whereas GPT doesn't know the truth. There's no notion of truth other than what's embedded in the text it learned. But then the way it works, it's stochastic. And so, of course, it's going to hallucinate. So for me, it's not even a surprising thing. Of course, it hallucinates. Every word it says, it's a hallucination that can be more or less aligned what we think is true. It depends on the topic. Because if a lot of texts are about the same thing and they all agree, then it's probably hallucinates less. But when we go to the edges of human knowledge and ask about that, then it will just go on and generate words and will not tell you how sure it is about the veracity of that sentence. And so for me, it's almost like a feature, not a bug. If we get rid of this, they will become just search engines, which we already have. So this hallucination problem is definitely embedded in current technology. And the way out of it in John's essay is that we need to create agents, AI inside, but they also have to have a body. They have to be embodied for rewrite in reality, and they have to experience reality, so they get a stake in what they say. Because truth is basically, you can make a claim that truth is what makes you survive. You have to care about the truth, otherwise you would just die as an organism. So what was perhaps the most interesting point for you in that essay, or in any other stuff he does? How come you got stuck to it like I did?
Was it the 4E and AI, something like that? Was it 4E and
uh,
or
yeah, I
was
mean,
it the 2012? Um, so like I guess what so I kind of like these kind of become blurred for me. Oh, the YouTube talk that I linked to. Yeah.
yeah. So you linked the video essay, which is called uh, AI, the coming thresholds and the path we must take. So it's
Mm.
about it's a program. That's why I like it's a
Yeah.
program, not a prediction. But then you also mentioned that you watched some of the videos of the awakening from the meaning crisis. So we can discuss
Sure.
anything.
Sure.
you
Yeah,
like.
so yeah, and I would be curious to hear so I was reading your Substack, and I really appreciated your you sharing kind of how you're digesting and thinking through some of these concepts, and like yeah, so it's fun. I love that we're talking about this. Um, and so yeah, like, for me, this is kind of like the later episodes of the Meaning Crisis, where he kind of points to where things are going. And he brings up things like, and I think this comes up more in after Socrates, maybe he's more, where he kind of followed up this year with in the Meaning Crisis series. But he talks about things like opponent processing. I think that's right. I think it's the phrase he uses. I find this especially salient. This is really important. As an educator, this is something we think through quite a bit. Um, but this seems to be what he's getting at when he talks about, like, the importance of embodiment is that you get things, at the level of dialogue you get opponent processing, but then at the level of embodiment you get error, error correction, right? It's like, oh, I expected this, this is like relevance realization, like, here's my model of what this room looks like. But then, like, I run into the side of the door because it's glass, but I thought it was a door, but it's actually glass, right? So I get feedback there, right? And so I think opponent processing is really important, and I think useful for thinking about some of the hallucination problems that we see, and like where things might need to go to correct for those. Um, how can you build in tension? How can you feel build in feedback mechanisms that I think at the user level, right? This is the trouble with teaching around ChatGPT, is that students figure out very quickly that they can make the tool tell them whatever they want, right? And so this is the weird thing. You use these tools, there's truthiness to it. It knows so much, but then you can make it say whatever, you can make it agree with you, and whatever you can kind of you can distort things very quickly, right? And even if it's aligned, you can jailbreak it and get it to do things for you and say things that it wouldn't otherwise. So
Yes, yes.
how do you, if this is, I think this is the concern with, these LLMs mediating, if this becomes our primary form of dialogue, right? If some people, increasingly have virtual experiences, where's the opponent processing coming into play, right? That's critical for
Yes,
for
yes, yeah.
truth, you know?
It's almost like you have to play your opponent there because there is nobody there. Like I
Yeah,
really like there are
yeah,
so many examples of opponent processing that I can actually pragmatically use in my life. So that's why I'm saying that what John is teaching is so important for me as a map. One of them is this, for example, what we do in this podcast which is I had to learn how to be with my thoughts and listen to you at the same time and sort
mm,
of like making it smooth. And I'm still a student of that. It used to be that either I was just listening, which was very nice, but I felt like I was not heard, or I was giving a course.
sure.
And then I didn't listen to the feedback. So that's, for example, for me, one of the examples where I have to learn to listen to my body. How do I feel when you speak, and from those feelings, what comes out. The other
Yeah,
example is you mentioned jujitsu in the beginning, so I wrote down how I got into martial arts very late in my life, like 3 years ago. And that's even more, there is no verbal communication there. So for sure, ChatGPT is useless there. Maybe robots in, I don't know, 50 years or something, but I wouldn't swear that it will arrive. So it's basically two humans and we fight. There are rules, of course. And what I've been learning is that when you fight, you can not only defend and you cannot only attack. In either case, you'll die or you will be beaten, you know? Because if you just attack, you're not listening, you're not paying attention what the other is doing. If you only react, then you basically give all the initiating of the the collisions to the other. And so at the end, you fear will take over, and again you will be beaten. So you have to get into this flow, which is very much opponent processing in the sense that you listen, you act, you listen, you act. Sometimes you initiate, you listen to the response, you react, etc. And a lot of martial arts is actually teaching the basic elements of these dances. So that's what we are actually practicing procedural in the second P, of not only how to move your muscle, but also what are the sequences in this dance. So you can use it then in a situation when you have to improvise. So it's almost like learning an instrument and then you can improvise as a jazz musician. So these are just a couple of examples where you mentioned opponent processing, which is one of John Vervaake's terminology, or I don't even know if it's his, but I know it from him.
Yeah.
Where this helps.
Yeah, it's kind of essential to how I was thinking through the meaning crisis, certainly. So one of the biggest things that that I would say I get from his work, and how what I find helpful for thinking about how to present this technology to students, and also like when I'm comparing Vervaeke's approach to people like David Deutsch. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but also like you see, on Twitter, there's the EACC, the effective accelerationist crowd, and the techno optimists, right? There's interesting things going on there. That kind of freaks people out. But I think it's an example of some things that are responses to the meaning crisis as this technology emerges. Is people like they're doing something and they're leveraging, I think, certain concepts to try to keep the momentum going, right? And so for Becky, his idea of relevance realization is highly powerful here. I think that's like the way he thinks about the role of attention and relevance realization as it relates to machine learning. Like he was writing about this in 2012, and then he's been updating it since then. And in these recent talks, he seems like he's deploying is it the 4 Ps and the 4 Es? Uh, um, but embody, so things like procedural learning, but also embodiment, right? I guess it's the 4 Ps that he's focusing on in that particular episode. But yeah, so procedural learning, he's to me, a lot of these are like his the overarching, one of the most important concepts is relevance realization, because it's kind of like the pivot point for everything else to come into play, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah,
so it's kind of an abstract, but like so let's think about like EACC, so effective accelerationism. They are um they're borrowing ideas from Jeremy England about thermodynamics. I don't know if you've heard of Jeremy England. He's like I think he's a he was at MIT. I think now he lives in Israel. But he did interesting work around
yeah.
thermodynamics.
Life, no, how life
Yeah,
started. Yeah, I know, I know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So like his, you might be able to translate this better than me, but my understanding is that like one of his central arguments, or kind of what he's known for, is that life emerges from the or we see a lot of order as heat dissipates
This dissipation,
more
which is very
efficiently.
paradoxical for me. I remember this. Yeah, yeah. Because I thought it was so we are accelerating the heat death basically. That's in
Yeah.
this way, right? Just sucking the
or
entropy out of sun, building the
yeah,
structures, but
yeah,
this process is actually dissipating the energy into infrared faster
yeah.
than without life.
Yeah, so yeah, something like that. And so like, well, even like a sand dune, for example, can
Yeah.
dissipate. Like that's like sand dune is not, quote unquote life and as we normally think of it, but it's increased order that dissipates heat, right? So it deflects, it kind of more efficiently dissipates the wind, the energy from the wind, and kind of, it expresses that dissipation is expressed as increased order. And so
So
it's interesting how effective accelerationists used, the work of Jeremy England, and also David Nick
I didn't
Land.
know that. I didn't know that that was one of their foundational things. So they its
Yeah.
acceleration is because they want to accelerate this, right? Somehow.
So this is, yeah, so I noticed this when because so this is, so just to be clear, I'm not like in effect I don't see myself as EACC. I'm just interested. I track what they do because
Uh-huh.
a number of these folk are what's driving the technology. So to
Yes,
me
yes,
it's
yes.
relevant. It's like, hey,
Yeah, of course,
these
yeah,
are people
because
doing
yeah,
the
that's
work.
where the tools that you have to adapt to will come from. Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, and so the if there's a Substack, I think I forget which one of the Twitter accounts created this, but there's a Substack devoted specifically to EACC. It was supposed to kind of birth the movement or is connected with the origin of the movement. There's only like two articles, and they both explain the principles and kind of the purpose of EACC. And so they link to in the manifesto. You call it kind of a manifesto, one of the articles links to the work of Jeremy England, and they refer to thermodynamics quite a bit in their kind of discourse. Like they talk about GPUs, flops, all this stuff, and they talk about for them it's like expressing thermodynamics. And there's a lot of I've seen discussion on this in Less Wrong, the other EA, like the EA crowd, right? And they're responding to and trying to think through what's going on with the ACC, and they noticed that um sorry, I like lost my train of thought. So the EA crowd has written quite a bit about the EACC crowd, and oh gosh, I lost the thought.
Yeah, I follow a little bit the debate, and
Yeah,
what I found the
yeah.
most interesting is that they sort of like the fundamentalist religious and atheist debate, where I'm looking at this from an outside point of view. They share the framework where,
Mm,
like for them, like God is a proposition, God exists is a proposition basically,
mm,
which is for me it's not. And for these two crowds, the accelerationists and the doomists, it's the same thing for me. Is that basically I don't agree with the framing,
mm,
and they seem for them it seems to be even transparent that there's a framing.
mm,
And this is where John's work come in for me, because what he
mm,
says is that the framing is the thing. What you do within the frame that can be formalized. You can have your Bayesian probabilities, and you can do calculus, and you can
Well,
even do
because so
LLM.
EACC and so they're both Bayesian, right?
I
That's my
don't know if they're
understanding
both
largely.
Bayesian, but they
Uh,
basically live in this world where it seems to me that you can decide what the goal is, and then you achieve the goal,
mm,
which is of course true. I mean, it's not, none of this is like coming out of the blue. It is true that we can, as agents, we can decide goals and we can achieve those goals. But where those goals come from, it's outside the system. And if you start staying outside and looking in, describing those goals, then where are you standing? That's
mm.
Jonathan Pageau's big question. When
Oh,
people
interesting.
describe the universe as we were not inside.
Yeah.
And so that leads to the alignment question, where I think they would agree, both of them, that alignment is a question of rules. So that would be for me. I will have to talk to people from those communities, because I'm not completely sure that this is true. But it seems like both the community that wants to align AI today and the other community, which mainly doesn't care about that much, agree that the alignment will be solved by imposing rules on AI.
Mm,
So that's what I call a framing. Whereas
mm,
John says that, try to do it with your kids. Before we started to record, you mentioned that you have two small kids. Like,
mm,
you never know. It doesn't work. you cannot, you can impose rules to a certain extent to the kids, and it is an important developmental stage where they learn how to obey rules and look and obey the authority and develop the
Hmm.
notion of an authority and trust. But this is only part of their psyche. There are so many other things going on there, and this is not, you can become a person like that and you get stuck in your life because you cannot get out of the, as soon as the rule based world around you collapses or you have to go outside, you don't have the capacity to adapt. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, because well, John even thinks that we should treat um when they we give them opponent processing through embeddedness, right? So that they need to have something akin to bodies, and we should treat them as persons. And so what's interesting is that is that David Deutsch, who is not he doesn't have the same framework um as John Vervaeke, but he's famous for the fabric of reality, the beginning of affinity. David Deutsch, I think he developed the idea of quantum computing, but he also thinks that, or he says that anything that's AGI, anything that has intelligence like humans do, or the ability, or he calls it creativity. For him, that's kind of the key thing here. The ability to generate new explanations. For him, that's kind of the big thing. Like once we get to that point, then we have AGI. He also thinks he's like anything that can create explanations is human. Is like I mean, that's what it is. And so like there's this interesting overlap there between David Deutsch and how he thinks about AGI and
I
where
see, I see. I don't know
John
his work. Yeah, I know his
yeah,
name,
yeah.
but
But
this is interesting. It depends again
but
what you mean by explanation. Yeah.
so the one thing I wanted to get back to that I think w- h- is important for Vervaeke's idea of relevance realization and the role that it's playing in these companies that are developing this technology is so what I forgot and then I just remembered as
Yes,
you were
yes, yes,
talking
yes.
is the EA crowd on Less Wrong. They're kind of they've been writing about effective accelerationism and how to think through and respond to them. And they pointed out that, like philosophically, epistemologically, it's not terribly sophisticated how they're developing their system, which makes sense. It's a manifesto, right? It's a movement. It's not like a philosophy, right? So I think that's important to realize. And to me, this is the heart of relevance realization. They're creating a model that gets shit done, right? They're like, hey, we want to work fast. What framework can we use to keep that energy going, right?
Mm.
And so this is their idea of techno optimism that Mark Andreessen he published in Manifesto, but also the entire movement is kind of based on this. But on Less Wrong, they pointed out that EACC is kind of based on collapsing. That they're like, okay, the work of Jeremy England shows that life emerges from the dissipation of heat, right? It's all about thermodynamics. Therefore, we ought to work on continually to create more order and structure based on the dissipation of heat, right? So it's kind of like this. It's almost like from David Hume, like a philosophical fallacy. They're just saying like, oh, hey, this is like this is how life is. We want to move. We want to continue that ordering effect, by and how we dissipate heat. Um, um, but you'll see that like in the work of Sam Harris. He's been thinking through AI, and he also thinks that um he's also fine. He's like, hey, this is, we need to get our off from the is. That's how like the world is ordered in certain ways, and that tells us, that gives us clues with how we ought to act, right? So like, how this relates to Vervaeke is like for him, this is like these models or these manifestos are important to pay attention to because it's how this technology is being organized and taking shape. And I think it
Mhm.
helps make sense around, how these communities, how the networks are taking shape, right? They're taking shape through these I think he likes to use the kind of a translation of Neoplatonism, these kind of top-down models. These are the manifestos, and this is bringing order to the movement. and then of course things trickle up, right? That like there's going to be pushback, there's going to be complexities, open AI, there's leadership crisis and all that stuff. But yeah, so that's kind of what that was probably a messy mouthful of like EACC and Vervaeke, but that's kind of how that's why I pay attention to when Mark Andreessen publishes a manifesto on techno-optimism, because it's absolutely about relevance realization and bringing order to this momentum, right?
Yeah, and he has, because what John says, that relevance is not something you can have a theory about, because it depends on you, the agent, and the arena, which is your environment you are in. You can have a theory how we make sense and how we find the relevant information in a given situation, and that's what he's doing. So he has a sort of like framework about of how we realize relevance, how we find the salient features when we walk into a room or in a forest or in a certain situation before we do any inference. So this is where for me it was eye-opening, that everything you do after that we can formalize, like Bayesian inference or statistics or logic or even arguments, it supposes that you already created the space in which you can state those things, and that creation of that space is what relevance realization is. And so
But so that happens unconsciously. Doesn't that happen? I don't know if he makes this distinction, but does that happen? So unconsciously, he calls this the imaginal, I think, in some of his talks. Unconsciously, we imagine the space around us. But then, is there a conscious ordinate effect that happens through stories and narrative? Is that also relevance realization? Because he's big on we probably seen the same talk, but he's, I think, in conversations with Jonathan Pageau, he talks about this, right? Where we have these stories that order the that order reality and provide people want to know, where am I going, before they, like, hey, where, this is the kind of career I want before I go to college, or else I'm not going to have the motivation, and I'm not going to make sense of, like, I need to know that this credit I'm taking, that I'm paying X amount of money for, is meaningful. And it's meaningful because it's relevant as it's tied to the end goal, right? And so for him, this is at least this was, I thought, I thought this was like why he found uh was kind of interweaving relevance realization and Neoplatonism, because it's like, we create these stories, the symbolic framework, and that allows us to put our lives together, right?
yeah, exactly. So stories are part of the symbolic world. That's how we make sense of uh, of the symbolic world, which is basically for me what's above us. It's not the things we can touch or do. You can argue about that. So what he says about the narrative, so he has another framework where opponent processing, of course, works, is which he usually uses the computer game analogy to explain this. So there are three things you need to get into flow in a world. You have the nomological structure, which is basically physics, how things work. Things fall, fly, bump into walls, and in a good computer game, those physical things, maybe it's not physical in the same sense as our physical world, like in Tetris, although they fall, but it's sort of abstract. But you know what's going to happen if you do something. So that's one thing. The second thing is that you need a goal, a normative goal. Tetris is really nice because it's sort of almost like an abstract game, and it still sucks you in and gives you dopamine and everything. So you have a goal. You know exactly what you have to do to achieve. You don't know what to do, but you have agency on certain things, and you know what's going to happen, and you know what's your goal, which is to pile up as much bricks as you can. And the third one is the narrative, if the story of you, the hero, getting better and better and better, right? So you improve yourself, and that's the third element. And then flow is, of course, the whole thing that gets it together. You get into this state where you're always at the edge of your abilities. And that's the other thing computers game really manage to do, is because you have these levels, so your level is always a little bit above your capacity. So that gives you a lot of incentives to stay there and do the and play the game, right? And games simulate this. The problem with computer games, of course, that they suck you in, they give you all this dopamine, but you get out of the game and you are in the real reality where you have to earn money and you have a life. Okay, so he uses the games as to explain these three concepts, but at the end the idea is that in a lived life you have those three things, and this is where narratives play a goal. And this is how religion comes in, not necessarily a formal religion, but the kind of stories you create. Look, so for me, all these movements are about, look at them, like they all create a goal, they all create something difficult to achieve. They have their nomological structure, how the world works. And this is usually the issue with that, is that it's always failing. Every theory is a theory. It's a beautiful order, it's a Platonistic order, but at the edges, you fail, and you have to change the structure. So that's the issue with the nomological structure. And within that structure, you have the game. You want to accelerate whatever thermodynamics or whatever your goal is, right? And there is a community, and in the community of your social standing, so you have your serotonin thing if you climb high up in there. So they all have these features which are features of a well-lived life. But if it becomes too rigid, so this is where they fail, that they think that that's the world. And this is theologies which are sort of, every theology has a dogma, every theology has a system, but at the end, the now Platonistic religions that were developed like 2000 years ago, the ones that survive, they are open. Okay, so you don't have a strict value hierarchy other than you have God on the top, but God is exactly the thing that's undescribable. So you cannot put them into words and into rules, and that's a feature of the system, the feature of the open system. So this is where I think his system gives a lot of almost like points you to hang on my experience, right? And so that's why I like him so much, and because it's that particular essay I also like, because most of the people who criticize the movements, either the accelerationist or the doomist, they just criticize, they are negative. So your approach to GPT is not their approach. It's their approach to GPT is to try to regulate, which is also just another rule-based system, which will work to a certain extent, but probably will not solve the situation. But his proposal is pragmatic and constructive. Like John really says, okay, when we get embodiment, this is what we do. Don't give it the porn industry and the military, because they will do it. They have the strong incentives. So let's do it differently. And probably that means exactly the opposite as the regulationist group wants, which is close everything, put it into a rigid hierarchy. That's exactly how the military will get it, The porn industry will work on the fringes, illegally probably. The military will be inside the hierarchy that regulates everything, and they will develop the embodied AI. Whereas if we open it up, we have more chance to make it good. Okay, so in that sense, I'm allied with the people who are for openness, right? we have to be careful, but on average, I would say it's better to fail being totally open than to try to put everything into a rigid hierarchy at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's forcing like bigger conversations about, not only how to align these tools with incentives incentives that we care about, but also like, things like truth, like values, like at a fun, like how do you have alignment that is something that there's a lot of consensus around versus partisan? I think this is raising that question. And that's, I think, I don't see that going away. I don't know how. I guess it's hard for me to imagine a model that is not partisan to some extent, at least,
Yeah,
in the normal way we talk about that.
yeah. That's the
But
actual.
it's something we have to care about, right? Like it's something that we should be attempting to do versus just like pretending that it's possible to have a completely agnostic in every sense, machine, right?
Yeah, we won't get agreement on this soon. So it's that's it. That's another argument against regulation, that it's really really hard to get something through the political system that's meaningful.
It, as you were talking, it's kind of, I think, something that it reminded me of is that like it yeah, when these tools started to roll out, it seemed like there was it was like there's like a renewed interest, uh or kind of a renewed appreciation for the power of ideas to shape reality. Like I don't know if that's kind of a stretch, but it felt like that's kind of a vibe to some extent. It's like, oh wait, I can do things just by writing words into a little blank on my screen. Like I can do quite a bit, a lot more than I thought. And so I mean, yeah, like this is natural language processing. That's kind of like the mediating technology there, right? So we're kind of hooking up NLP to these powerful neural networks, and these neural networks are increasingly linked to other tools that can do very powerful things. And I think like, yeah, um, uh, you mentioned Jonathan Pageau. I know he talks about this, but I think Vervaeke brings this up as well. Is there's going to be a lot of interest in um, esotericism and hermeticism. I think there already was, because post COVID you saw this kind of exploding. But I think there's this technology is kind of an opening for that, and it's going to be very messy, right? Like it's going to be a competition of stories about all those structures you were talking about in kind of a very clear way. And so I'm kind of interesting to see that play out. It's also kind of terrifying in some ways. You like there's at the political level it plays out, right? In the United States, Hungary, I'm sure there's it sounds like there's a version of that there as well. Um, and so like yeah, it's kind of like it can be, I don't know, it can have certain like negative effects, but it seems like there's in some ways going to be an increase in an awareness of how stories are really important to all of these projects, right? And it's going to be expressed in the classroom, but also in politics and all these other ways. And it's not going to go anywhere. Like this is something we're going to have to deal with again and
Yeah,
again.
yeah. He had one phrase was really nice there, which he said that the irony of the Enlightenment is that the idea was to get rid of religion and be rational, fact based, science based, right? Which is what happened was that we lost the tools, the practices, the rituals to connect to
Hmm.
something bigger than us. And now, from all this Enlightenment project, what comes out is this monster AI,
Hmm.
which is bigger than us in any of the stories, singularity or accelerationist. It is something bigger than us. And we don't have the tools to relate. So people are going anywhere they can find tools, chants, rituals, group things, esoteric, whatever. These
Hmm.
pieces of the grammatic puzzle that remains from the destruction of the let's say classical religions, that they can hang their
Mhm.
desire to connect to this bigger thing
Yeah,
on.
yeah, no, this is key, and I think this plays out in the in the classroom as well. The lack of a shared symbolic framework, the lack of a consensus around certain like values, um, is leading to some of this confusion. So like, where is this AI going? How should we view the distinction between humans and machines? All of that, right? Like the different symbolic frameworks kind of like hang this in different ways. Like they kind of play around with these terms in different ways. And so what it means to be human, what it means to be machine, whether or not you can use terms like hallucinate, or whether or not you need to like never, whether or not you should be very, very careful about anthropomorphizing what's going on, right? This is because of the symbolic framework that's being used to think through what's these interactions, right? And and like I see this in the classroom. I see this, at the institution that I'm at, where people are trying to think through like, wait, what are our shared values, right? So yeah, we have a college mission, a school mission, but I think in public education more generally, like how do we respond ethically to these tools, that requires a certain kind of consensus around certain key values. But right now, those are really hard to identify for some people. How to spell those out, what that looks like, is really hard. And so you're getting, just as we're getting this technology that's extremely powerful and seeming to create quite a bit of disruption, you're also getting a cynicism around public education. And again, like I don't know how to think through this, United States versus Europe. Um, um, and Hungary, but like the United States, there is kind of a rift right now between public education, private education. We saw this more recently. There's just increased cynicism around how, quote unquote elite institutions are responding to current events. And so there's kind of fracturing in the public space. And education plays a key role in this, right? And so I think it's going to, so one of the questions I have is this going to, force bigger conversations around what our values are?
Mm,
Is that just going to be impossible, and we're just going to see more fracturing,
mm.
and you'll have more, these more tribal or local institutions or expressions of education, and they're going to have to figure out
Yeah.
their mini shared consensus, right? So yeah, that's an open question for me,
Mm.
but it seems important.
Yes, so we are almost 2 hours in. Time flies. So I think we covered most of the things I was thinking about covering. Do you have any question to me that you would be interested in?
I guess the one thing, just looking at your background and how you're like what you did before, what you've done before all this technology, like I think you were already giving talks on the machine learning within the workflows of like scientists, right?
Mhm,
Back in
mhm,
2018.
mhm, mhm.
And I think in 2017 is when that famous like attention essay by Google employees, right? When that attention is all you need,
Transformer.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it had come out just a year prior, and so it may not have affected a whole lot by 2018. But you're like, so you're into this very early, and I guess I'm very interested in what you think someone like me, especially like I'm a supervisor, kind of department chair, in a humanities discipline, right? And and I come at this from a very different angle. Like as you're talking, I can kind of see like your engineer side come across, like you're very articulate and specific about certain processes. I love that. But I'm curious, like given your background, what you wish or what you think educators, especially with my background, should probably be aware of, or what we might be missing, given what you know.
Hmm. Thank you. Interesting question. I would point back to John. I think if his stuff is digested and applied, that would be really, really good, because it gives you not only the structure but also directions. The thing is that I'm also telling it to myself, because I think his stuff resonates more with humanity, people than with engineers, because he comes from philosophy, comes from social science, cognitive science. He's not an engineer, even though he worked a lot with AI scientists on the engineering or research side. His language is probably easier to understand for somebody with a philosophy background or psychology background than an engineer. So it's probably easier for you guys than for us to understand him. But that's definitely where I would point to for guidance, how to what to do with the technical stuff. The others, otherwise, it's I sort of empathize with your position where this thing just coming at you with no, you have no agency of what the Silicon Valley guys will produce next time, or very
Yeah.
little. Maybe you can influence it through how to use their tools, and so their product development will take into consideration with the how people use this. Uh, just
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah.
share your experience. So that's one of the things why
Hmm.
I'm talking to you, because I'm curious, but also because I think we should talk from the engineering side. We should talk a lot to people who start to use this. And I'm optimistic in a sense that yes, the religions are shattered and everything is sort of like in a state where you don't really have one big framework to believe in. At the same time, our value systems are pretty much aligned compared
Hmm.
to, I don't know, tribal history. And so we do have a shared value system within which we can function and in which we can guide the development. Most
Yeah.
of the time, the bad things that come out of tech are not on purpose. So I'm
Hmm.
pretty, I mean, you have always some bad guys, but most of the
Hmm.
time it's side effects that
Hmm.
can backfire, not really the original objective. So thinking with the tech community about, okay, we want the good, how to do the good is, I think, where, in an ideal political landscape, that's the discussion that should take place. Now, I'm not sure if it helps.
No, you're very optimistic about that. I like that. Maybe the framing should be like, hey, there's probably more consensus than we think. We
Yeah,
should we should lean into that, right? We should try to tease that out. That's gonna be more conducive than always focusing on, where things are fracturing, right? Or we need to have that in mind as well. Have you last question, have you read I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but Carterescu's Solenoid?
mm.
That's the translation into English. It's a I guess maybe he's a Romanian
Romanian, it
writer.
sounds Romania. Yeah,
Yeah. So I wasn't sure if that was
it's a science fiction.
yeah, it's like it's very surreal. I think it was published within the last decade or so, but it was recently translated into English. But yeah, it takes place in I thought it took place in Budapest.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, Bucharest is
Bucharest.
maybe
Yeah.
what I'm thinking of. Yeah, Bucharest. Um, but yeah, it's a fascinating novel. So
Okay, I'll check it out. Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you for the suggestion, and thank you for the nice discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, this was fun, Balazs. I wasn't like I didn't really have any questions in advance, so I was, kind of
It's okay.
terrified I wouldn't have like interesting responses, but it's nice that we have
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Vervaeke and other kind of a common language that we can use. So I
Mm.
appreciate that.
Yes, thank you very much. Bye, Joel.
Balazs.